Hi there and welcome to my July wrap, in which I reflect on both the quantity and the quality of what I've read these last 4 weeks before nominating my book of the month. Now, in terms of quantity, it was nothing special. I read 7 novels, 1 work of history, 1 piece of life writing, 2 academic books and 7 short stories. But in terms of quality, it was far and away the best month since I began the channel. So let's begin by looking at the 6 books I read by or about Surrealist writers. We start off with Dorothea Tanning's Gothic novel Chasm, a Weekend, which is set in and around a large house in the Arizona desert, and what I really enjoyed about this book is the fairy tale-like quality of 2 of the characters, the young girl, Destina, and her great-grandmother, also named Destina. It seems at first as if these figures will be marginal to the book's action, but actually they prevail in the end while bloody destruction rages around them. A very strange novel, but very rewarding too. Next up is Unica Zern's semi-autobiographical novel Dark Spring, which centres on a young girl's sexual awakening. And what was so interesting about this book was the way in which fantasy was preferred to reality until the reality can no longer support that fantasy and the girl's world duly collapses and she contemplates ending it all. This book can be read at a single sitting. It's very precise and very candid, and I found it really moving. Most of you watching this have probably never heard of it, neither had I. Nevertheless, it's definitely worth checking out. Next we have Leonora Carrington, who's one of my favourite artists and writers. I've already spoken about her short story The Debutante in a previous video, link in the description. This time I read her The House of Fear and Notes from Down Below, focusing on the latter, which is her account of an episode of mental illness she experienced and her confinement in a lunatic asylum. This happened in 1940 as World War II was raging, and as part of her paranoid visions, Carrington became convinced that the fate of the world lay in her hands. It's a truly remarkable piece of life writing, and I'll just read you a little extract to give you a taste. To me, Van Gent was my father, my enemy, and the enemy of mankind. I was the only one who could vanquish him. To vanquish him, it was necessary for me to understand him. He gave me cigarettes. They were pretty scarce in Madrid, and one morning when I was particularly excited, it dawned on me that my condition was not solely due to natural causes, and that his cigarettes were doped. The logical conclusion of this idea was to report Van Gent's horrible power to the authorities, and then proceed to liberate Madrid. An accord between Spain and England seemed to me the best solution. I therefore called at the British Embassy and saw the consul there. I endeavoured to convince him that the World War was being waged hypnotically by a group of people, Hitler and co., who were represented in Spain by Van Gent, that to vanquish him it would suffice to understand his hypnotic power. We would then stop the war and liberate the world, which was jammed, like me and Catherine's Fiat, that instead of wandering aimlessly in political and economic labyrinths, it was essential to believe in our metaphysical force and divide it among all human beings, who would thus be liberated. This good British citizen perceived at once that I was mad, and phoned a physician, Martinez Alonso by name, who, once he had been informed of my political theories, agreed with him. To deepen my understanding of Surrealism, I read 2 books about the movement. The first of these was taken from the very short introduction series, which I'm a huge fan of. It was written by David Hopkins and titled Dada and Surrealism, and he explains how Paris Dada morphed into Surrealism under the guidance of André Breton. It's a very informative text. It has lots of plates of Surrealist paintings. The only disappointing thing is they're all black and white, so you have to head over to Google Images to find the colour versions. And on that theme, I wish to show you a painting I found in here that I'd never seen before. It's by a Cuban artist, Wilfredo Lam. It's called The Jungle, and I have to say, it's quickly become one of my favourite paintings ever. See what you make of it. Just magnificent, and if you wish to see the real thing, it hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan. Okay, the second book I read about Surrealism was edited by Anna Watz. It's a history of the Surrealist novel. Now, the introduction by Anna herself was absolutely amazing. Such a mine of information, and from that I found many more interesting surrealist works I'll be reading through in the coming months. The other chapters were rather hit or miss, but one in particular was a big hit. It was Gavin Parkinson, and it was Surrealism and the science fiction novel. And from that chapter, which was so well researched and clearly showed his passion for the topic, I found some really intriguing science fiction writing that I'll also be bringing to you in the coming months. Okay, one more book on surrealism and then we'll move on. This was a work of history, Paper Bullets, Two Artists Who Risked Their Lives to Defy the Nazis, by Jeffrey H. Jackson, published in 2020, and it centres on the lives of two French women who were involved in the Surrealist movement. Their real names were Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Malherbe, but they went by the names Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore for their artistic practice, and Claude Cahun in particular has become very famous in recent years. There is so much interest because the pictures of her show she was many decades ahead of her time when it comes to playing with gender. She was gender fluid in today's terminology, or non-binary, take your pick. And this book centres on how the two women, who were childhood friends and indeed lovers, relocated to the Channel Island of Jersey shortly before World War II broke out, and they were there throughout the Nazi occupation of the island, and they engaged in acts of resistance using their art to try and demoralize the Nazis and turn them away from war, and eventually they were arrested and sentenced to death for their activities. It's a riveting read, and I've since reached out to Jeffrey and he's agreed to do an interview for the channel, and that should be coming in a month or so. I'm so excited about that. Paper Bullets, a just wonderful book. Okay, now for my other reading, and I'll group 3 novels together now. The first of them was Sir Walter Scott's Waverley, the first of his historical novels. Not his best by any means, but I still really enjoyed it, and I'm making a review of this that will also be coming in August, fingers crossed. Then Marguerite Fourcenar, a new name to me, with her Cuda Grace, or Cuda Grace, and this was a beautifully written, powerful book about a love triangle during the Russian Civil War between the narrator and an aristocratic brother and sister. It reminded me in its intensity and its repressed eroticism of D.H. Lawrence's magnificent short story, The Prussian Officer. One thing that has to be said also is Fourcenar is clearly an absolute genius. I've read some of her other works during the month, just skimming through them, and this is an intellect of the very first rank. I can't believe she's so little known, it seems, in the Anglosphere. Thirdly, a writer who is extremely well known in the Anglosphere, Nobel Prize winner Günter Grass. I read his Cat and Mouse, and I have to say, it was incredibly disappointing. It was hard to understand why the narrator took an interest in the events they were narrating. They centered upon his adolescence and a particular member of the group of teenage boys he hung around with, who did admittedly exhibit some strange traits in his behavior, but not enough to hold the interest of the reader anywhere near as much as he held the interest of the narrator. It is, to be fair, the second part of a trilogy, so perhaps I should read the first and the concluding part before coming to a final judgment, but this reading did very little for me. I also read 2 Gothic novels this month. Indeed, I've already posted a short video about them, so I'll just note the titles here. William Godwin's Caleb Williams, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and Charles Brockden Brown's Edgar Huntley, or Memoirs of a Sleepwalker, which has the distinction of being the first Gothic novel set almost entirely upon the North American continent. Okay, the short stories I read this month all belong to the science fiction or fantasy genre. The first 6 were by Richard Matheson, best known as a writer for the TV show The Twilight Zone. These I did not find that impressive from a literary point of view, but they did have satisfying twists, I suppose, and they did demonstrate quite a fertile imagination. Better by far, in my view, however, was the end of the story by Clark Ashton Smith. It was set in 1789 in France, but it did not focus on the political upheavals at the time. Instead, it was set in a spooky chateau where an abbot welcomed a visitor who insisted on reading a mysterious manuscript locked in the abbot's desk, and then embarked on a rather risky journey from which he was saved at the last moment. Its gloomy atmosphere was really satisfying. He's seen as the most successful disciple of H.P. Lovecraft. I can't wait to read more of his writings. Okay, time for my book, or should I say books of the month, and then I'll bid you farewell. So yes, there are 2 books of the month this time around. I think that's justified, not just on the grounds of quality, but because they belong to different genres. Non-fiction, Paper Bullets by Jeffrey H. Jackson is my book of the month for July. Riveting history. Then Caleb Williams by William Godwin, a superb Gothic novel, right up there with Frankenstein. So there we have it. That was my great reading month. How was yours? If you came across any interesting titles you think might interest me, please let me know what they are in the comments below. But now, as promised, I must say goodbye. So, until the next time, be safe, be strong, nanu nanu.